Du Fu looking at the countryside. West mountain in white snow, 3 towns guarded. Southern shore of a clear river, bridges 1,000 li apart. The whole country in wind and dust, my brothers scattered. Alone at the end of the world my tears fall. Past my prime now, old and sick, never of service to my country. I'll mount my horse, ride out beyond the city, unable to endure the bleakness of our lives. So we continue with Du Fu's poems, and this poem, looking at the countryside, I have discovered that it's part of a series of 4 poems about the same topic. I'm not exactly sure when they would be, when they were written. If these poems in this section were following a chronological order, this would have been after Du Fu's reaching Shu, or perhaps slightly afterwards that, when he got on the move again. So the topic of this poem is describing the country, and therefore it would appear to be a descriptive landscape type poem from the title. But the emphasis in this poem is not just nature, description of mountains and fields and rivers and so on. It's not a typical landscape poem. It's rather describing us, the human, not only the natural landscape, and it's embedded in a very specific time, which is the An Lushan chaos, the period of time just after the An Lushan rebellion, when the whole country is in uproar. There are many references also in the poem to Du Fu himself, so it's a poem of, you could say, of biographical information. There's a juxtaposition between the things that he is seeing and the sadness that he is feeling at a specific time and place. Very typically in the poems that reflect the scholar official's persona, which we can imagine is pretty much also Du Fu's real mental state and real feelings at the time. So we have Du Fu lamenting the times, lamenting being separated from his family, lamenting growing old day by day and not being able to serve the country, to help the country get out of the quandary in which it had just fallen because of the rebellion. And in fact, it's a pretty bleak poem. Bleakness appears in the last line, and the whole tone of the poem is pretty bleak. So I would say that there are many poems by Du Fu like this one, and some of them more famous than this one, I feel, which reflect this idea of looking at the country, seeing the turmoil ingrained in nature, perhaps contrasting nature's indifference or apparent indifference to human suffering and its cycles to an individual human's lack of cycles, to his decline and fall. The same with the countries or the dynasties' decline and fall, which, well, in the case of dynasties, you do get a certain cyclic order as well, because dynasties fall but others succeed them. In the case of specific dynasties or individuals, of course, there's no such renewal. Scarcely likely in the case of a dynasty, completely impossible in the case of an individual. So let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet as usual. First couplet: West mountain in white snow, 3 towns guarded. Southern shore of a clear river, bridges 1,000 li apart. So the first couplet locates us. The description, at least for me and without any notes, is pretty generic. You know, I do not know where we are located, where Du Fu is located, or what specific space he is wanting to describe with this couplet. So it's clearly, like the title says, an area, relatively countryside area, outside of the cities. We get a big mountain, a west mountain, which is covered in snow. So this could be anywhere in, it could be perhaps in Shu, which is an area full of mountains. So we have this image of this mountain crowned with snow, and we have 3 towns next to it, or relatively close to it, seen from the distance probably, and they're fortress or garrisoned places. So The description would easily match one of those mountain passes that lead into Shu and that were relatively easy to defend. So perhaps, the enemy troops, the rebels, might be relatively close by, and the mountain passes have to be garrisoned, or even if they don't have to be, the garrisons are there. And this is a juxtaposition of human and natural. The mountain with snow, the towns with the guards. It's a juxtaposition of human and natural. And the second line has the same structure as well. Southern shore. It feels like a parallelistic couplet. The first couplet of a regulated poem does not have to be parallelistic, but it seems like Du Fu did go all the way into parallelism here. So southern shore of a clear river. South matches west. Shore matches mountain. Clear matches white. River probably matches snow. So southern shore of a clear river, bridges 1,000 li apart. So apart from seeing those mountains in the background, or that west mountain covered with snow and some villages, fortified villages next to it, probably closer to himself, Du Fu sees he sees a big course of water. He's either looking at the south shore or he is in the south shore. Not many bridges. Why are there not many bridges over the water? Perhaps they have been cut down to avoid enemies crossing the bridges. The interpretation of these bridges 1,000 li apart is ambivalent. In other translations, the idea is that the bridge is a huge 10,000 li bridge, which would be a hyperbole. No bridge can be that big, but perhaps there were big bridges crossing these expanses of water that Du Fu is contemplating. So whatever the idea, either the bridges are far apart or the bridges are very long. The idea that is transmitted, bridges are human construction, is of this big distance covered, enormous distances. And again, probably as a background, this threat of rebellion or of enemy use of said bridges to penetrate into the land. So the first couplet was pretty descriptive of specific natural and human elements of the landscape. Second one becomes more abstract, more generic, more philosophical, and it also starts pulling Du Fu's heartstrings by telling us how he is feeling right now. The whole country in wind and dust, my brothers scattered. Alone at the end of the world, my tears fall. This couplet is the summary of the whole poem. You could have a poem in a couplet. If you could synthesize this poem in a couplet, I think this couplet synthesizes it, and lots of other Du Fu poems from this time. The country is in chaos, country is in war. That wind and dust, is a metaphor for the uproar of the country, for people moving to and fro, for battles and sieges and everything. My brothers scattered, so the family, remember in the Alushan rebellion, Du Fu got cut off from his family and from his family seats. His family is dispersed all over the empire. He is far away, alone at the end of the world. This can be rhetorical, but we might imagine that he's probably in the northwest region, so pretty near the frontier of Chinese and barbarian civilization. So he's probably pretty far away from most of populated and civilized China. He feels alone. He feels lonely. And he's crying. So this sadness at being alone, this sadness at being far away, this sadness at the country's peril. This is a signature trademark in a lot of Du Fu's poem, the way he juxtaposes private, personal grief with national grief, how the country is collapsing in the aftermath of the rebellion and the wars, and how his own life is collapsing. He has no longer an official position as a scholar official at court. He is getting old, he's feeling sick, he's separated from his family and roots. So there's a juxtaposition of national and personal catastrophes that this poem synthesizes very well. The whole country is in wind and dust, and my tears fall. Third couplet, so the first couplet located us geographically. The second couplet expanded the scope to the whole country and to how Du Fu is feeling. The situation of the country, not a description of the country. And, it started to push us into the more subjective path of exploring Du Fu's feelings. And the third couplet continues that. You could say it's a commentary and expansion of the second couplet. Past, well, centered on Du Fu himself. Past my prime now, old and sick, never of service to my country. So at this time of crisis, Du Fu is not only far away from the centers, he feels he's rather useless, a broken tool. He is too old, he's too sick, and we know he's not just being rhetorical. He was, for the period that we're talking about, he was relatively old, and he was suffering from many illnesses. Never of service to my country. He is frustrated in his hopes of having served the country in high office, the ideal of every Confucian scholar official, and Du Fu was not too successful. He had briefly served in some minor offices during Xuanzang's reign. During the Anlushan Rebellion, he had briefly served in Suzong's court at the Chancellery, I believe. And during the liberation of the capital in 757, 758, he had also served at court. No longer now. He is out of office, probably, and he knows it, probably for the remainder of his life. He will never again be in the government service. So any ideals of Confucian service are, bashed against the ground. He is old. He can't serve the country at the moment of his country's greatest need. So finally, being aware of this, feeling this, what is Du Fu's last action in this poem? Well, in the last couplet, like the Lone Ranger in the westerns or in comic books, he sets out on his horse towards the sunset. A sunset which is his own personal sunset, his decline and death, which are going to happen in the not so distant future. And he just goes away. He was already far away and lonely, so he goes even further away and into further loneliness, out of the darkness into another darkness, as Izumi Shikibu would say. I'll mount my horse, ride out beyond the city, unable to endure the bleakness of our lives. So the poem ends in this, heart-wrenching image of the poet going away in his horse, sad, and, his heart is broken. His life is ruined. The country seems to be ruined. So, as I said, it's a relatively well-composed poem, quite a crafty piece of poetry, as usual with Du Fu. But the tone is, very, very unremittingly bleak. But quite a nice poem. I think it reflects very well, along with other poems that are like it, Du Fu's feelings about his personal and the national predicament at the end of the Anlushan Rebellion. And poems like these are the ones that probably justify Du Fu's popularity and enduring high canonical appreciation in the Chinese tradition. Not only his expert craftsmanship, but the way, and the mastery of a very artificial and complex form like the regulated poem, even more in the heptasyllabic line, where the antithetical parallelisms of characters become more difficult because you have 7 now in each line instead of 5. But apart from these technical mastery, technical prowess, the way in which he embodies the ideals of Confucian scholars to the utmost, and the way in which he is able to reflect and mix together personal crises that all scholar officials have to face, old age, lack of success in positions, with the distress of the country at the time in which he was living. And, poets would subsequently adopt this type of role and this type of persona and write their own takes on similar poems that also reflect contemporary problems of scholars aging and national crisis and wars looming.